March 20th, 2023 marked 20 years since the U.S., along with its coalition partners, launched a military invasion into Iraq. The war was initiated as part of President George W. Bush's global war on terror in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001 attacks. The Bush administration claimed the government of Saddam Hussein was amassing weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, posing a threat to the U.S. and its allies. On February 5, 2003, U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the UN Security Council, making a case for intervention based on what he said was solid intelligence that Iraq possessed WMDs.
My colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. Numerous human sources tell us that the Iraqis are moving not just documents and hard drives, but weapons of mass destruction to keep them from being found by inspectors. We know that Saddam Hussein is determined to keep his weapons of mass destruction. He's determined to make more.
The call for intervention was met with protest. On February 15, 2003, millions of people around the world marched against the imminent war in Iraq. Several weeks later, on March 19th, President Bush launched airstrikes over Baghdad, signaling the beginning of the war.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
Britain, along with Australia and Poland, formed a coalition with the United States. British Prime Minister Tony Blair echoed the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction as he deployed British troops to Iraq with Parliament's blessing.
Tonight, British servicemen and women are engaged from air, land and sea. Their mission? To remove Saddam Hussein from power and disarm Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction. This new world faces a new threat of disorder and chaos, born either of brutal states like Iraq, armed with weapons of mass destruction, or of extreme terrorist groups. Both hate our way of life, our freedom, our democracy.
On March 20th, troops were deployed on the ground. U.S. allies joined, and within 3 weeks, Saddam Hussein was ousted from power. Despite the mass protests in February, by March 24th, a Gallup poll found that 72% of Americans supported the war. By September 2004, more than 1,000 American soldiers and some 5,000 Iraqi soldiers had been killed in Iraq. At that same point in the war, more than 10,000 Iraqi civilians had already lost their lives. That same month, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan would tell the BBC that, from the perspective of the UN Charter, the war was illegal. A few weeks later, in October 2004, the top U.S. arms inspector Charles Dulfer reported that he was unable to find any evidence of weapons of mass destruction made in Iraq since 1991. Furthermore, he said that Hussein's capability to produce weapons had weakened in the 12 years of sanctions leading up to the 2003 invasion. A Gallup poll conducted several days later reported that a majority of Americans believed going to war in Iraq was not worth it. In March 2005, the Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities in the United States concluded that the intelligence community was dead wrong in almost all of its pre-war judgments about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, referring to it as a major intelligence failure. But the war dragged on. The U.S. did not conclude its combat mission in Iraq until August 31st, 2010, when President Barack Obama announced its end. The last U.S. troops were withdrawn by December 14, 2011. More than 4,400 U.S. soldiers were killed during the fighting. Estimates of the number of Iraqi lives lost range from over 100,000 to over 1 million. While the precise number of lives lost is difficult to ascertain, a 2018 analysis by the Washington Post said the death toll is probably around 600,000. Beyond the casualties and cost of the Iraq War, the Islamic State militant group, also known as ISIS or ISIL, arose out of al-Qaeda in Iraq in response to the U.S. invasion, historians agree. Shortly after the 2003 invasion, the Iraqi army was disbanded, with some former soldiers going on to form ISIS, taking weaponry from the army with them. Today, Iraq continues to struggle with the instability and sectarian fighting that its central government has been unable to rein in. Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch report human rights abuses, including wrongful arrest and imprisonment, torture, extrajudicial killings, and gender-based violence. From the death toll of civilians and soldiers, to the forced displacement of millions of Iraqis, to the physical and psychological injuries sustained by those who lived through the war, the human cost of the Iraq War today remains incalculable.